The door of the surgery burst inward off its top hinge, and Charles Lockhart looked up from the mortar and pestle in his hands to find the point of a broken spear leveled at his throat. "Heal me," the orc woman said, "or I open your neck and heal myself with your blood." She filled the doorway the way a storm fills a valley, tall enough that she had to duck beneath the lintel, one arm clamped hard across a gash that ran from her ribs to her hip, blood soaking dark through fitted leather armor the color of old rust. Her other hand held the broken spear steady despite the way her knees trembled, despite the gray pallor beneath her green skin. Tusks jutted from her lower jaw, small and sharp and somehow not ugly on her, not on a face with cheekbones like axe blades and eyes the color of struck flint. Black hair, matted with sweat and blood, had come half loose from a braid, and even wounded, even bleeding out on his threshold, she looked less like prey fleeing and more like a wolf that had simply chosen, for the moment, to stop running. Charles did not drop the pestle. He did not run. He had stitched too many wounds by lantern light, had held down too many screaming men while digging arrowheads from their thighs, to let his hands shake now, even with a spear an inch from opening his throat. "You'll bleed out before you manage to swing that," he said, and his voice came out steadier than he felt. "That's a bad wound. Gut deep on the left, maybe nicked the muscle over the hip bone. You keep standing there posturing at me, you'll be dead before whoever's chasing you even arrives." Something flickered behind the flint-gray eyes. Not fear, calculation. "How do you know someone chases me?" "Because you came through my window shutter instead of the front door of the inn," Charles said, nodding at the splintered wood hanging from its hinges, "and because no one bleeds like that from an accident. That's a spear wound, close range, meant to kill. Somebody wanted you dead and you're still standing. That tells me you're either very lucky or very good, and either way, you didn't come here to kill an apothecary. You came here because you need one." For a long moment the only sound was her ragged breathing and the distant clatter of the trade road outside cart wheels, a dog barking, the low murmur of the crowded common room down the hall where travelers of every stripe drank and gambled and slept off the dust of the road, oblivious to the bleeding giant crouched in the surgeon's doorway. Slowly, the spear point lowered. "Fix it," she said. It was not quite a plea. Orc women, he would learn, did not plead. "Fix it, human, and I will not kill you for touching me." "Generous terms," Charles muttered, already reaching for clean linen and the jar of distilled spirits he kept for wounds too dirty for honey and yarrow alone. "Get on the table, lie back, and put that spear down before you fall on it." She did not sit so much as fold, control leaving her body all at once now that the immediate threat of speech was done, and Charles caught her shoulder before her skull could crack against the table's edge. Up close she was heavier than she looked, all corded muscle beneath the leather, and she smelled of blood and pine sap, and the particular acrid tang of a body that had been running hard through fear. He eased her down, and for one strange, suspended second her hand caught his wrist, not to threaten now, just to hold her grip like an iron manacle, her eyes locked on his face as if she were trying to memorize whether he meant to betray her the instant she closed her eyes. "I won't hurt you," Charles said quietly. "I've never once hurt someone I was trying to save. Bit of a professional principle." Her grip did not loosen, but something in her shoulders did, just slightly, the way a bowstring eases when the arrow has already left it. "Snaga," she said. "My name, Snaga Steeljaw. If I die on your table, human, I would have you know it." "Charles Lockhart," he answered, already cutting away the ruined leather at her side with the small curved knife he used for such work. "And you're not going to die on my table. I've got better manners than that as a host." That, impossibly, drew a huff of breath from her that might have been the ghost of a laugh, cut short by a hiss of pain as he pressed a folded cloth hard against the wound to slow the bleeding. The Wayfarers' Crossing had stood at the meeting of three roads for longer than anyone in the border towns could remember. A sprawling stone and timber inn with a common room big enough to seat 60, stables for 40 horses, and a surgery wing that Charles had built onto the east side with his own hands 6 years past, after the last apothecary had died of a fever nobody could name. It was the kind of place where secrets moved as freely as goods, merchants heading north with bolts of dyed wool, hunters coming down from the high passes with furs, orc traders from the clan territories bartering iron and hide for salt and grain, soldiers, tinkers, runaways, and men who asked no questions so long as none were asked of them. Everyone who traveled the great trade road passed through the crossing eventually, and everyone who passed through eventually needed Charles Lockhart's needle and thread. He had stitched more men than he could number. Broken bones set, fevers broken, poisoned wounds lanced and drained, an arm saved from the rot that would have taken it, a soldier's collapsed lung reinflated with nothing but a hollow reed and steady hands and more prayer than skill. He was 31 years old, unmarried, quiet in the way of men who have spent too many nights alone with the dying to feel entirely comfortable among the living. And if the girls of the border towns ever noticed the gentle, competent, solitary healer at the crossing, they noticed him the way one notices furniture useful, unremarkable, easily overlooked in favor of louder men with better prospects and easier laughs. He had never, not once in 6 years, expected an orc warrior to come crashing through his window with her guts nearly spilling out, and he certainly had never expected, as he worked the curved needle through her flesh with a hand gone steady from long practice, to feel his heart hammering for reasons that had nothing to do with fear. She watched him work. That was the strange part. Most patients looked away, or grit their teeth and stared at the ceiling, or passed out from the pain of the spirits in the wound. Snaga Steeljaw watched his hands the entire time, her flint eyes tracking every motion of the needle, as if she were memorizing the geography of her own rescue. "You do not flinch," she said when he had closed the worst of it and moved to bind the wound in clean linen. "Most humans flinch touching us." "I've touched worse than orc blood," Charles said. "Blood's blood, bone's bone, doesn't much matter the color of the skin around it." "Skarn's men would disagree," she said, and her jaw tightened, tusks catching the lantern light. "They would say orc blood is different, cheaper, easier spilled. Skarn's men are the ones who did this to you." She was silent long enough that he thought she would not answer. Then, "No, my own clan's men did this, sent by my own father." Charles set down the needle. Outside, a cart rattled past on the trade road, and somewhere down the hall, a drunk trader was singing badly off-key. And none of it touched the sudden, terrible quiet in the little surgery room, where a wounded orc woman lay bleeding on a human healer's table and told him, in a voice gone flat with old grief, exactly how her own blood had tried to kill her. Snaga Steeljaw was chief of the Ironvein clan, and he had raised his only daughter to be a warrior worth fearing, had trained her himself with spear and axe from the time she could walk, had watched her win her first blooding at 14 summers and her first true kill at 16, had boasted of her to every rival chief who dared question the Ironvein's strength. And then, 3 months before Snaga came crashing through Charles Lockhart's window, Snaga Steeljaw had looked at his fearsome, capable, battle-proven daughter and seen not a warrior but a debt to be paid. The blood feud with the Skarn clan ran 20 years deep, back to a border raid that had killed Ugrok's brother and half a warband, and though the fighting had guttered to occasional skirmishes and stolen cattle in recent seasons, it had never truly ended. Gorbash Skarn, chief of the rival clan, had proposed at last a peace that both sides could stomach, a bride trade, sealed in the old way, to bind Ironvein and Skarn together in blood and kinship rather than grudge. Gorbash wanted a wife of Steeljaw blood to sit beside him and end the feud for good, and he wanted, specifically, the chief's own daughter, the fiercest prize Ugrok had to offer, proof that the peace cost the Ironvein something real. Ugrok had agreed. He had not asked his daughter. "I was to be given," Snaga said, staring at the ceiling beams while Charles finished binding her ribs, her voice carrying the particular bitterness of someone still disbelieving her own history even as she recited it. "Not asked. Given, like a fine spear or a good hunting hound, to a man twice my age who buried 2 wives already and wanted a third strong enough to survive him. My father's price would be paid in scarn cattle and scarn iron, and I would be paid nothing at all, because a daughter is not owed payment for her own life, only obedience. And you refused. I refused. Her hand curled into a fist against the table, the knuckles pale beneath green skin. I told my father I would not be traded like grain for a peace I had no voice in making. He told me refusal was not a warrior's right, only a warrior's duty to accept. When I would not yield, he sent Drask and 4 spears to bring me back in chains, so that I might be presented to Gorbash Skarn as a properly humbled bride. How many did you fight through? 5. She said it without pride, without shame, a simple fact. I killed none of them. I am not fool enough to make my own father's grief worse than it already will be. But I left them bleeding on the ridge road, and Drask put his spear through me before I put him on the ground, and I ran. And I did not stop running until I saw the lights of this place and thought better to die among strangers who owe me nothing than to be dragged home in chains. Charles finished the last knot of linen and sat back on the low stool beside the table, studying the woman who had just handed him, without flinching, without asking for pity, the whole raw shape of her own betrayal. "You're not dying tonight," he said. "Not on my table, and not on the road either if I've anything to say about it." Snaga turned her head and looked at him, really looked, the way she had not quite managed while he was stitching her closed, and something in her flint-colored eyes shifted, some old wariness cracking just slightly at the edges. Why would a human care what becomes of an orc woman fleeing her own clan? "Because you're a person bleeding on my table," Charles said simply, "and that's reason enough for me. Been reason enough for every soul I've patched up in this room, whatever their blood. I don't much care for the arithmetic that says some folks' lives are worth less than others." For a long moment she said nothing at all. Then, quiet, almost too quiet to catch over the noise of the common room down the hall. "Most would not agree with your arithmetic, apothecary." "Most," Charles said, rising to fetch her water and a blanket against the shock that would follow the bleeding, "have never had to sew a man closed by lantern light at 3 in the morning while he screamed for his mother. It changes what you think people are worth." He did not sleep that night, though he let her have his own narrow cot in the surgery's back room while he dozed fitfully in the chair beside her, one hand never far from the small belt knife he kept for cutting bandages, not from fear of her, but from the certainty that whoever had put that spear through her side would come looking, and would come to the wayfarers crossing first, because every road eventually led there. They came on the 3rd day, and Charles Lockhart's life divided cleanly into the time before that morning and everything after. Drask arrived at the head of 4 riders in Ironveen colors, their spears bound in strips of red cloth to mark them as clan enforcers on lawful business. And the innkeeper, a sharp-eyed, broad-shouldered woman named Hesper Vane, who had run the crossing for 20 years and taken no nonsense from God, chief, or king in all that time, met them in the yard with her arms crossed and her voice like flint on steel. "This is neutral ground," Hesper said, plain and hard, "same as it's been since before your grandfather's grandfather rode this road. No clan business gets settled with spears in my yard, Drask, and you know it." "We seek a runaway," Drask said. He was a broad orc with a scarred jaw and a voice like gravel, and behind him his 4 riders sat their horses with the tense stillness of men expecting a fight. "Chief Steeljaw's daughter. She is wounded, she is dangerous, and she is promised to Chief Skarn as a peace bride. Any who shelter her shelter a thief stealing from her own father's honor." Charles stood in the surgery doorway with his arms folded, doing his level best to look like a man with nothing to hide, while behind him, hidden in the narrow gap between the surgery's back wall and the stacked grain barrels of the storeroom, Snaga Steeljaw crouched with a boning knife in her fist and murder in her eyes. And it took every ounce of nerve Charles possessed to walk out into that yard and lie to 5 armed orc warriors with a straight face. "Haven't seen anyone matching that description," Charles said when Drask's gaze swung to him. "Plenty of travelers through here, though. Might have missed her in the crowd." Drask's eyes narrowed, taking in the healer's plain apron, the calm hands, the utter absence of fear that should have accompanied a lie told to an armed clan enforcer. "You are the apothecary." "I am." "A wounded orc woman does not simply vanish into the hills with a spear through her side, human. She would need a healer. She would need this place." Drask's gaze slid past him, toward the surgery door, and Charles felt his pulse hammer even as he kept his voice level. "If she'd come through my door bleeding, friend, I'd have treated her same as I'd treat you, or any man on this road. That's the whole of my trade. But she hasn't, and I'll thank you not to search a healer's surgery for patients I haven't got, same as I'd thank any man not to go rifling through a farmer's barn hunting cattle he doesn't own." It was Hesper who broke the standoff, stepping forward with the particular authority of a woman who had thrown drunker and more dangerous men than these out of her yard by main force. "You've had your look, Drask. This is my inn and my yard, and I say there's no runaway bride hiding among my guests. You want to search every room and every barrel on the strength of your say-so. You'll do it over my objection, and word of an Ironveen enforcer trampling neutral ground will reach every trade caravan between here and the coast inside a week. Is that the story you want carried back to your chief?" Drask held Charles's gaze a moment longer, some old soldier's instinct clearly itching at the back of his skull, and then, at last, he wheeled his horse. "If she surfaces here," he said, "know that harboring a chief's promised bride is an offense the Ironveen will not forgive lightly, and know that Gorbash Skarn's patience for his stolen peace is shorter still." They rode off down the western fork of the trade road in a spray of dust and receding hoofbeats, and Charles did not let himself breathe properly again until they had shrunk to specks on the horizon. Snaga emerged from behind the grain barrel's pale beneath her green skin, the boning knife still clenched white-knuckled in her fist, and when Charles turned to her, she was staring at him with an expression he had not seen on her face before, not gratitude exactly, something rower and more startled than that. "You lied to Drask," she said, "to your own kind's enforcer for a stranger and an orc besides." "I lied to a man threatening someone under my roof," Charles corrected. "Wasn't about your blood. Would have done the same for anyone. Would you?" It was not quite a question. "I like to think so." He rubbed a hand over his face, feeling the aftermath of the fear catching up with him now that the danger had passed, his hands trembling faintly where they had been so steady moments before. "Though I confess this is the first time I've had to do it with quite this much at stake." Something in her seemed to loosen then, some final knot of suspicion coming undone, and for the first time since she had crashed through his window 3 nights past, Snaga Steeljaw smiled at him, small, crooked, showing the edge of one sharp tusk, but a real smile warm as summer sun through storm clouds. "Then I owe you a debt, Charles Lockhart," she said, "and orcs do not forget debts." "You don't owe me anything," he said, "but you're welcome to stay until you're properly healed, longer if you need it. Hesper won't mind another set of hands about the place, and the stable's short-handed since Tomlin twisted his ankle." She stayed. The days that followed unspooled slow and golden, the ordinary rhythm of the crossing folding around the two of them like a shelter neither had known they needed. Snaga worked the stables in trade for her keep, her strength making short work of tasks that left the stable boys sweating and swearing, and travelers who might once have eyed a lone orc woman with suspicion learned quickly to give the surgeon's guest a respectful berth after watching her lift a cart clean out of a rutted mud-hole with her bare hands, while 3 grown men stood around scratching their heads. Charles found reasons to be near her that had nothing to do with medicine, bringing her meals she did not need brought, checking wounds long since healed, lingering in doorways to watch her braid fresh hay into rope with quick, competent hands. She, in turn, found reasons of her own. She began appearing in the surgery in the evenings, ostensibly to learn the healer's trade. A warrior who can close her own wounds owes nothing to any battlefield surgeon, she told him, though he suspected, from the way her eyes lingered on his face rather than his hands, that her interest ran to more than technique. He taught her to identify yarrow and comfrey, to pack a wound to stop bleeding, to set a simple fracture, and she absorbed it all with the same fierce focus she must once have brought to her spear training, asking sharp questions, correcting her own grip on the needle without complaint when he adjusted her fingers. It was during one such lesson, 3 weeks into her stay, that the careful distance between them finally broke. She had been practicing stitches on a strip of tanned leather, her tongue caught between her teeth in concentration, and Charles had leaned across the table to correct the angle of her needle, his hand closing over hers to guide the motion. A gesture he had made 100 times with 100 different patients, purely instructional, purely professional. But her hand turned beneath his, palm to palm, fingers lacing through his own, and when he looked up she was not looking at the leather anymore. She was looking at him, close enough that he could count the flecks of amber in her flint-gray eyes, close enough to feel the warmth of her breath. "Snaga," he said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. "You have been careful with me," she said quietly, "since the first night. Careful with your hands, careful with your words. I have watched you be careful with every soul who comes through that door, human and orc alike, and I have wondered these past weeks what it might feel like if you stopped being careful with me." "I didn't want to presume," Charles admitted. "You're a guest here, a woman running from a betrothal she didn't choose. Seemed a cruelty to press you toward another choice you hadn't asked to make. And if I am asking now—" The lantern light caught the sharp planes of her face, softened the fierce lines of her into something achingly beautiful, and Charles Lockhart, 31 years old, unmarried, a man who had spent so many years overlooked that he had nearly forgotten what it felt like to be seen, found himself leaning across the narrow table without quite deciding to do it, and Snaga Steeljaw met him halfway. The kiss was not gentle. It could not have been, not from a woman built for war, not with 3 weeks of aching, unspoken want behind it. Her hand fisted in the front of his shirt and pulled him closer, her mouth hard and hungry against his, and Charles felt something in his chest crack wide open, some door he had kept shut for years now flung suddenly to the wind. When they broke apart at last, both breathing hard, she pressed her forehead to his, tusks grazing gently against his cheek, and laughed low in her throat. "There," she said, "now we have stopped being careful. Snaga, do not apologize," she said fiercely, pulling back just enough to look him in the eye. "I have had men fear me my whole life, Charles Lockhart, or want me only for what I could win them in a war band, or resent me for a strength they could not match. I have never had a man look at me the way you look at me, as though I am simply a person worth knowing, worth wanting, without needing me to be less than what I am." "You're the most remarkable person I've ever met," Charles said, and meant it down to his bones. "I don't want you to be less than anything. I just want you to be safe, and if you'll have me, I want to be part of whatever safety looks like for you." "Then be careless with me a while longer," she murmured, and kissed him again, slower this time, and Charles Lockhart understood, with the particular clarity of a man who has spent his whole life waiting without knowing what he waited for, that he had just found it. The weeks that followed were the happiest of his life. He knew, in some quiet corner of his mind, that it could not last, that a chief's runaway daughter and the border town healer sheltering her lived on borrowed time, that somewhere out past the western hills Snaga Steeljaw's grief and fury were surely curdling into something more dangerous, that Gorbesh Skarn's patience for his stolen peace bride would not last forever. But he let himself have it anyway. Those stolen evenings in the surgery with the lantern burning low, those mornings watching her work the stable yard with sunlight catching gold in her dark hair, those nights when she came to his narrow room after the common room had gone quiet and curled against him with a fierceness that felt, every time, like being chosen all over again. "You could stay," he told her once, weeks into it, her head resting against his chest, one of her powerful arms draped across him like she meant to anchor him to the earth. "Not just until you're healed. Stay because you want to. I know it's not much, a healer's room's at a crossroads inn. I know your clan would call it beneath you. My clan would call many things beneath me that I have found to be worth more than all their gold and cattle combined, Snaga said, tracing idle patterns against his collarbone. I have thought of little else these past weeks, Charles Lockhart, but how I might stay, how I might make a life here that is truly mine, chosen by my own hand and no other's. What's stopping you? She was quiet a long moment. Tradition, she said at last. Among my people, a woman does not choose her own worth. Her bride price is set by her father, paid by her suitor's clan, and she is given like coin passed hand to hand. I fled that fate once already, and my father will not simply let it go. Sooner or later, Charles, he will find me, or Gorbash Skarn's patience will run dry and he will come looking himself. And when that day comes, I do not know that hiding will save either of us. Then we won't hide, Charles said, though even as he said it, he did not fully know what he meant by it, only that the thought of losing her to a stranger's claim, to a tradition that treated her like property instead of a person, made something in him go hard and desperate and determined in a way he had never felt about anything before. We'll face it, whatever it takes. He did not know, that night, how soon those words would be tested, nor how badly, nor in front of how many witnesses. The crossing's great market day came once a season, when trade caravans from 3 directions converged on the inn's yard, and the surrounding fields sprouted temporary stalls selling everything from dyed wool to forged nails to fresh bread. And travelers and townsfolk and clan traders alike filled the ground shoulder to shoulder for 2 full days of commerce and noise and celebration. It was, Charles would later reflect with grim irony, the single worst possible day for anyone to be careless. They had not meant to be seen. That was the terrible, mundane truth of it, not recklessness, not defiance, simply 2 people stealing 5 stolen minutes in the quiet shadow of the stable's hayloft, while the market roared on outside, Snaga's hands framing his face, his arms around her waist, a kiss meant to last only until the next customer needed the stable boy's attention. The stable door banged open on Drask and 3 Ironveen riders, come not searching this time, but simply passing through the market crowd on some trade errand of their own, drawn by nothing more than the accident of an unlatched door swinging wide in the wind. And behind them, close enough to see everything, close enough that his roar of fury silenced the entire crowded yard, stood a broad, gray-tusked orc in chieftain's furs that Charles had never met but somehow knew, with sick certainty, could only be Snaga Steeljaw himself, Snaga. The single word cracked across the yard like a whip, and every head in that crowded market turned as one, traders and travelers and townsfolk alike, hands going still on their wares, conversations dying mid-sentence, until the only sound in the whole wide yard was the creak of the hayloft ladder as Snaga Steeljaw climbed down to face her father with her chin high and her human lover's hand still, deliberately, defiantly, held in her own. Snaga Steeljaw was a mountain of a man even among orcs. His gray-streaked braids hung with iron rings that marked each battle he had survived, his face a roadmap of old scars, and his eyes, the same flint gray as his daughter's, burned with a fury so total it seemed to steal the very warmth from the autumn air. 3 months, he said, his voice shaking with barely leashed rage. 3 months I have searched every road and every clan hall for you, daughter, fearing you dead in some ditch, fearing Gorbash Skarn's patience spent and our peace shattered beyond mending, and I find you here, in a stable, in the arms of a human. His gaze swung to Charles like a blade unsheathing. You, the healer who lied to my own enforcer's face. The crowd had drawn into a wide, murmuring ring now, dozens of witnesses, traders, farmers, off-duty guards, orc clanfolk come for the market, Hesper Vane pushing through with her apron still dusted in flour, all of them staring at the spectacle of a chief's fury and his daughter's shame laid bare in the open market square. Somewhere in the crowd, a voice muttered the word unnatural, and another, uglier, spat something about a chief's daughter whoring herself to livestock, and Charles felt Snaga's hand tighten around his hard enough to bruise. "I did what any decent man would do," Charles said, stepping forward though every instinct screamed at him to run, to hide, to disappear into the crowd rather than stand alone before a furious chief and 100 hostile stares. "I healed a wounded woman who came to my door bleeding. I make no apology for that, and I make no apology for what's grown between us since." "You dare speak to me of apology," Ugrok snarled. "You have stolen my daughter's honor along with her hand." "He has stolen nothing," Snaga said, and her voice, when it came, cut through the crowd's murmur like a blade through cloth, loud enough to carry to every corner of that market square. "You forget, father, that I am not a purse of coin to be stolen or spent. I came to this place bleeding from wounds your own enforcer gave me, fleeing a fate you decided for me without once asking whether I wished it. I have found here in this stranger's care more honor and more choice than I found in all my years beneath your roof." "You are promised to Gorbash Skarn," Ugrok said. "That promise ends a war, Snaga. It saves lives, Ironveen lives, lives you were raised to protect. Would you throw away 20 years of peace for a human healer's bed?" "I would throw away nothing that was never mine to keep," Snaga said. "You never asked me, father. Not once. You decided my worth as though I were a hide to be traded, and you expected me to thank you for the honor of being sold to a man who has buried 2 wives already." Her voice cracked just slightly on the old grief beneath the fury. "I am your daughter, not your coin." Gorbash Skarn arrived at the edge of the crowd even as she spoke, drawn by the commotion with a dozen of his own riders in tow, and the sight of him broad-shouldered, iron-jawed, easily twice Snaga's age, his eyes narrowing with cold calculation rather than any warmth at all as he took in the scene, settled something hard and final in Charles's chest. This was the man Snaga had been meant to be given to. This was the fate she had bled and fled and hidden to escape. "Chief Steeljaw," Gorbash said, his voice carrying easily over the murmuring crowd, "I was told your daughter was found. I was not told she was found dishonoring herself with a human in a stable loft." His gaze slid to Charles with open contempt. "This is the price of your delay, Ugrok. I begin to wonder if the Ironveen truly wishes this peace at all." "The peace stands," Ugrok said quickly, and Charles heard, beneath the chief's fury, something that sounded almost like fear of what Gorbash's insult might mean for a fragile truce 20 years in the mending. "My daughter will be delivered to you as promised, Chief Skarn." "This dalliance changes nothing." "It changes nothing," Snaga said, her voice ringing clear and hard across the whole hushed yard, "because there was never a bargain I agreed to in the first place. But I will not simply run again, father. I am done running. If you would have this settled before the whole world, then let it be settled by the old right, the one no chief has dared invoke in 3 generations. I claim the trial of the blooded coin." A ripple went through the crowd, not the human traders who had no notion what the words meant, but through every orc gathered at the market, riders and travelers and clanfolk alike, a sound like wind through dry grass, murmurs of shock and disbelief rippling outward from where she stood. Ugrok's face had gone pale beneath its weathered scars. "You would not dare." "I would," Snaga said. "I do. Here, before witnesses of both our peoples, I claim the ancient right of every daughter of the clans, to win her own bride price through trial and set it herself, and choose for herself the one she gives it to, be he orc or be he human or be he anyone at all." "Or does the Ironveen no longer honor the old laws, father, when they prove inconvenient to a chief's ambitions?" "Explain this," Charles said quietly, low enough for only Snaga to hear, his heart hammering with a hope he barely dared feel. "What does it mean?" "It means," Snaga said, not looking away from her father's furious face, "that among my people before chiefs began trading daughters like cattle for convenient peace, a woman who felt her worth mismeasured could challenge that judgment in open trial. She fights traditionally against a champion chosen by whoever disputes her claim, and if she wins, she earns the right to set her own bride price from her own strength, her own winnings, and give it to whomever she chooses, with no chief's word able to override her claim. It has not been invoked in 3 generations because no woman has dared risk her father's fury to claim it. But it exists. It is law older than any peace treaty, and even a chief cannot simply unmake it before witnesses. The crowd's murmur had grown into open discussion now, dozens of voices arguing the point, and Charles caught snatches of it. Old traders confirming the custom's existence, younger orcs who had never heard of such a rite exclaiming in disbelief. And beneath it all, Snaga Steeljaw's face working through fury and calculation, and something that might, buried deep beneath decades of chieftain's pride, have been the first flicker of respect for a daughter who would not simply bow. "If you lose," Ugrok said at last, low and dangerous, "you go to Gorbash Skarn as promised, without further defiance, and this human healer's life is forfeit for the insult he has dealt this clan by touching what was not his to touch." Charles's stomach dropped at that, but Snaga did not so much as blink. "And if I win," she said, "you will accept my chosen bride price as fully paid before every witness gathered here, and you will trouble neither me nor Charles Lockhart again so long as either of us lives. Do you accept these terms, father? Or does your pride not stretch to honoring the very laws you claim to serve?" The silence stretched long and taut as a drawn bowstring. Then Snaga Steeljaw, chief of the Ironvine clan, nodded once, sharp and final. "I accept. Gorbash Skarn shall provide the champion since it is his claim you dispute. The trial will be fought at dawn, 3 days hence, here at the crossroads, before every witness who wishes to watch a chief's daughter gamble everything on old law and stubborn pride." Gorbash Skarn's cold smile did not reach his eyes. "I accept as well," he said, "and I will choose my champion with great care, Chief Steeljaw. Your daughter is strong, but she has been 3 months soft in a human's bed. We shall see how much of her father's blood remains in her." The crowd began to disperse then, buzzing with the news that would carry down every branch of the trade road within days. The runaway chief's daughter, the human healer, the ancient trial nobody alive had ever seen fought. Charles stood in the wreckage of the market's ordinary bustle with Snaga's hand still locked in his, and for the first time since Drask's voice had cracked across the yard, he found his own voice. 3 days, he said. "Snaga, you're wounded still, half-healed from the spear." "I am healed enough," Snaga said, though the flicker in her eyes told him she knew the risk as well as he did. "I have no choice left but this one, Charles. It was this, or be dragged to Gorbash Skarn's hall in chains, and I would rather die fighting for the right to choose my own life than live safely inside a cage someone else built for me." "Then I'll help however I can," Charles said, though the words felt desperately inadequate against the size of what she faced. "Whatever you need, whatever I have." Snaga turned to him then, and despite everything, the crowd's cruel whispers still hanging in the air, her father's fury, the mountain of a warrior Gorbash Skarn would surely send against her, she smiled, small and fierce and achingly tender all at once. "What I need," she said, "is exactly what you have already given me. A reason worth fighting for that is mine, and mine alone, to choose." The 3 days that followed passed in a blur of preparation and dread. Word of the trial spread down the trade road faster than any rider could carry it, and by the 2nd day the crossing's yard had swollen with spectators. Orc clanfolk from a dozen war bands, human traders and townsfolk drawn by rumor and curiosity, even a handful of travelers who had simply meant a pass-through and found themselves swept up in the drama unfolding at this crossroads inn. Hesper Vane, ever practical even amid chaos, had thrown open every room and doubled her prices without a flicker of shame, and the common room roared each night with speculation about the outcome. Charles spent those days doing the only thing he knew how to do, caring for Snaga's body as thoroughly as time allowed, checking the healing spear wound at her side daily, working oils into the muscle to loosen old stiffness, preparing poultices and tonics to strengthen her blood, teaching her, in return for all she had taught him of patience and courage, whatever small edge his healer's knowledge might grant her in a fight for her life. At night, when the noise of the gathering crowd finally quieted, she came to his room as she always had. And if their intimacy in those final nights carried a desperate edge, it hadn't before, hands memorizing what they feared losing, mouths finding each other with a hunger sharpened by dread. Neither of them spoke of it aloud. There was no need. They both understood exactly what stood to be lost at dawn on the third day, and they held each other through the darkness like two people determined to carve every ounce of tenderness from the time they had left, however much or little that might prove to be. "If I fall," Snaga murmured against his shoulder on the last night, her voice steady even as her hand trembled faintly against his chest, "you must run, Charles. Do not try to save me. Gorbesh will have no mercy for a human who dares interfere with a claimed trial." "I'm not leaving you," Charles said. "Whatever happens tomorrow, I'm not leaving you to face it alone." "You stubborn, foolish man." But she said it with such fierce tenderness that it sounded like the highest praise she could offer. "This is why I chose you, you know, not despite your foolishness, because of it. Because you have never once, since the night I broke your window, looked at the danger of loving me and decided I was not worth the risk." "You were always worth the risk," Charles said. "You'll always be worth it. Win or lose tomorrow, that never changes." Gorbash Skarn's chosen champion turned out to be a mountain of an orc named Bruk, a veteran of 40 battles with a chest like a barrel and forearms thick as young trees. And when he stepped into the roped-off dueling ground at the crossroads at dawn on the third day, stripped to the waist and hefting a war axe that looked capable of felling a small tree in a single stroke, a hush fell over the assembled crowd that Charles felt in his very bones. The dueling ground had been marked at the heart of the crossroads itself, at the meeting point of all three trade roads, ringed by torches still burning against the gray pre-dawn light, and packed on every side by spectators 3 and 4 deep, orc and human alike, merchants and farmers and clan warriors. Hesper Vane standing near the front with her arms crossed and her jaw set, Drask among the Ironvine ranks looking grim and conflicted. Snaga Steeljaw seated on a rough wooden chair at the ring's edge with his chieftain's furs drawn tight against the morning chill, and Gorbash Skarn beside him wearing the satisfied expression of a man who has already calculated his victory. Snaga stood at the opposite edge of the ring in her fitted battle leathers, freshly oiled and repaired, her dark hair braided tight against her skull, a single blooded iron spear in her grip. The same weapon, Charles realized with a jolt, that Drask himself had wounded her with, reclaimed and reforged as a symbol that she fought this battle on her own terms, with her own history, rather than borrowed strength. "The terms are set," Ugrak announced, rising from his chair, his voice carrying the weight of ritual across the hushed crowd. "My daughter, Snaga Steeljaw, claims the trial of the blooded coin, to win by combat the right to set her own bride price and choose her own match, free of any chief's decree. She fights Gorbash Skarn's chosen champion, Bruk of the Skarn clan. First blood does not end this trial, only yielding or death, or a fall from which the fallen cannot rise within a count of 20. Let the trial begin." Charles stood at the ring's edge with his heart in his throat, close enough to see every detail. The way Snaga's grip tightened on her spear haft, the way Bruk rolled his massive shoulders and grinned with the confidence of a man who had never once lost a fight, the way the whole crowd seemed to lean forward as one when the war drum sounded, and the two combatants surged toward each other across the packed earth. Bruk struck first, a massive overhand blow with his war axe that would have split a lesser fighter in two, but Snaga was not there when it landed, already sidestepping with the fluid speed of a woman who had trained since childhood for exactly this, her spear darting in low to score a shallow line across his ribs before she danced back out of range. The crowd roared, some in approval, some in dismay, and Bruk's grin flattened into something harder, more focused, as he turned to press his advantage with a series of heavy, relentless blows that drove Snaga backward step by grudging step toward the ring's edge. Charles watched with his hands clenched into fists at his sides, every healer's instinct in him screaming at the violence. Every fear he had ever felt about losing her concentrated into those long, brutal minutes as spear met axe again and again, sparks flying where iron struck iron, both combatants slicked with sweat and streaked with shallow wounds. Brooke was stronger, that much was clear from the first exchange. His blows came like falling trees, forcing Snaga to spend everything she had simply blocking and dodging rather than pressing her own attacks. But Snaga was faster and smarter, and 3 months of healing and love and purpose had given her something Brooke did not have, a reason to survive this fight that went beyond mere pride or duty. The turning point came when Brooke, overconfident after driving her nearly to the ring's rope boundary, overextended on a massive downward strike meant to end the fight in a single stroke. Snaga did not retreat this time. She stepped inside the arc of his swing, inside the reach of his axe entirely, and drove the butt of her spear hard into his exposed ribs, even as she used her own considerable strength to throw her shoulder into his overextended arm, sending the massive orc stumbling off balance for the first time in the entire fight. The crowd's roar became a single collective gasp as Snaga pressed the advantage, spinning her spear in a tight arc to sweep Brooke's legs from under him, and the champion of the Skarn clan hit the packed earth of the crossroads with a thud that Charles felt through the soles of his own boots. Snaga's spear point came to rest at his throat before he had even finished falling, and the whole crossroads went silent save for the crackle of torches and Brooke's ragged, defeated breathing. "Yield," Snaga said, her voice carrying clear and hard across the hushed crowd, "or die on this ground with witnesses from both our peoples watching. Choose quickly, champion of Skarn." Brooke's jaw worked, pride warring visibly with survival, but at last, with a low growl of frustrated fury, he let his war axe fall from his grip and raised both empty hands in the universal gesture of surrender. "I yield," he said. "The trial is hers." The roar that went up from the crowd then was deafening, a wave of sound that seemed to shake the very torches ringing the dueling ground, and Charles found himself shouting along with it before he even realized he had moved, vaulting the rope boundary to reach Snaga even as she lowered her spear and turned toward him. Blood and sweat streaked across her face, and a fierce, exultant light burning in her flint-gray eyes. "You did it," Charles said, catching her by the shoulders, hardly daring to believe it even as he said it aloud. "Snaga, you did it." "We are not finished yet," Snaga said, though she allowed herself, just for a moment, to lean her forehead against his, breathing hard, before straightening to face her father across the quieting crowd. "The trial grants me the right to set my own bride price, father. Now I intend to use it." Snaga Steeljaw had risen from his chair, his weathered face unreadable as he crossed the dueling ground to stand before his daughter, and for a long moment father and daughter simply looked at each other, 20 years of complicated history hanging unspoken between them. "You have won the right," Snaga said at last, his voice rough. "I will honor the old law as I swore before witnesses that I would." "Name your price, daughter, and name the one you would give it to." Snaga reached then into the leather satchel belted at her hip, the one Charles had noticed her carrying these past days without ever asking what it held, and drew out a heavy pouch that clinked with the unmistakable weight of coin, along with a folded scrap of hide bearing markings Charles did not recognize. "This," Snaga said, holding the pouch aloft for the whole crowd to see, "is every coin I have earned in my own name across 10 years of trading furs and iron at markets from here to the coast, saved and hidden against exactly such a day as this, when I might need to prove my worth was mine to spend as I chose. And this," she held up the folded hide, "is a marker of debt owed to me by 3 separate trade caravans I once guarded through the mountain passes, worth in goods and coin more than Gorbash Skarn ever offered for my hand. This is my bride price, father. Earned by my own strength, saved by my own hand, paid now to you as is proper, so that no one may ever again say I was given away for nothing, or taken without my own consent." She pressed the pouch and the hide marker into her father's hands, and Ugrok Steeljaw stood holding them, staring down at the weight of his daughter's own hard-won worth, something working behind his scarred face that looked, for the first time since he had appeared in that market yard 3 days past, less like fury and more like grief giving slow, reluctant way to something else entirely. "And who," he said quietly, though the whole crossroads strained to hear him, "do you give yourself to, having paid your own price?" Snaga turned then and walked back across the dueling ground to where Charles Lockhart stood, sweat-streaked and battle-blooded and utterly, helplessly in love, and took his hands in both of hers before the entire gathered crowd of both their peoples. "I choose Charles Lockhart," she said, loud enough that not a soul at that crossroads could claim not to have heard it. "Not because any chief decreed it, not because any bride price was paid by his clan to mine. I choose him because he never once looked at me as anything less than a person worth loving, because he stood between me and armed enforcers with nothing but his own steady nerve, because he taught me that a life chosen freely is worth more than any peace bought with a stolen daughter's obedience. I have paid my own price, father. Now I claim my own choice." The silence that followed felt, to Charles, like the whole world holding its breath. Then Gorbash Skarn's voice cut through it, cold with fury. "This is an insult," the Skarn chief snarled, rising from his seat. "The peace between our clans depended on this match, Steeljaw. You would let some old law undo 20 years of blood feud for the sake of your daughter's human plaything." "The peace," Ugrok Steeljaw said slowly, turning to face his rival chief with something in his bearing that had not been there moments before, a kind of weary, hard-won clarity, "was never meant to be built on a daughter's chains, Gorbash. I see that now, watching her fight for a right I had forgotten my own people once honored. If you want peace between Ironveen and Skarn, let it be built on something sturdier than one woman's stolen freedom. I will offer you fair trade concessions, grazing rights along the disputed border, whatever recompense honor demands for the insult of a broken match. But I will not sell my daughter to purchase your goodwill a second time. That price has already proven too costly for what little peace it bought." Gorbash Skarn's face twisted with fury, and for one taut moment Charles feared the whole crossroads might erupt into violence after all, dozens of Skarn and Ironveen warriors tensing at the edges of the crowd. But then, slowly, visibly biting back his rage in favor of calculation, Gorbash inclined his head. "Fair trade concessions," he said, "and grazing rights as compensation for this insult. I will consider it, Steeljaw, though know that I do not forget easily." His cold eyes swept once more over Snaga and Charles, standing together with hands still joined before the whole crowd. "Keep your human healer, girl. I have no wish for a bride who values a border apothecary above a chief's hall. Perhaps you were never worth the trade I offered in the first place." It was meant as an insult, Charles knew, but Snaga only laughed a real laugh, bright and unguarded, the sound of a woman finally fully free. "No," she agreed. "I was never worth trading at all, Gorbash Skarn. I was only ever worth choosing. It has taken my own father 3 months and a broken window and a healer's steady hands to understand the difference, but I am glad at last that he does." Gorbash Skarn withdrew from the crossroads within the hour, his riders falling in behind him with tense, unhappy expressions. And though the shadow of the old blood feud did not vanish entirely that morning, the immediate crisis passed, leaving in its wake a crowd of witnesses buzzing with the news that would carry down every branch of the trade road for seasons to come. The chief's daughter who fought for her own bride price and won, and chose a human healer over a chief's hall. Ugrok Steeljaw remained at the crossroads a while longer, watching his daughter with an expression Charles could not fully read, until at last the chief crossed the emptying dueling ground to stand before them both. "I do not fully understand this choice," Ugrok said gruffly, addressing Charles directly for the first time since the confrontation began. "A human healer over the wealth and standing of a chief's hall. But I watched you stand your ground before armed enforcers when you had every reason to run, human. And I watched my daughter fight harder for the right to choose you than she ever fought for anything I asked of her. That tells me something about the man you are, even if I do not yet understand the shape of it. I love her, Charles said simply, meeting the chief's flint-gray eyes without flinching, the same steady nerve that had carried him through every crisis of the past weeks. I know that's not much of an answer for a chief looking for reasons of politics and alliance, but it's the truest thing I've got to offer, and I mean to spend the rest of my life proving it's enough. Something shifted in Ugrock's weathered face, not quite a smile, but something adjacent to one, a grudging respect settling into the deep lines around his eyes. Snaga chose well in one respect at least, he said. You do not flinch easily, human. He turned to his daughter. The clan hall's doors remain open to you, Snaga, whatever choice you make of your own life from here. I was wrong to think your worth was mine to set. I will not make that mistake again, with you or with any daughter of the Ironvein who comes after you. Thank you, father, Snaga said, and for the first time since Charles had known her, he saw tears standing bright in her flint-gray eyes, quickly blinked away but not quite hidden. That is all I ever truly wanted from you, not gold, not peace bought at my expense, only the truth that my choice was mine to make. Snaga Steeljaw nodded once, gathered his furs about his shoulders, and departed the crossroads with his remaining riders, leaving behind a battlefield transformed, against every expectation, into something like a wedding ground. The wayfarers crossing through the celebration that night, and it seemed as though every soul who had witnessed the trial found some reason to stay for it, Hesper Vane declaring the ale free-flowing in honor of the finest spectacle her yard had hosted in 20 years of innkeeping. Orc traders and human farmers sharing tables and stories with an ease Charles had rarely seen between their two peoples. The common room's rafters ringing with music and laughter long into the night. Snaga sat beside him at the head of the largest table, her wounds tended and freshly bound by his own steady hands, her fingers laced through his beneath the table where the whole celebrating crowd could see. And when at last the noise and the well-wishing crowd thinned enough to let them slip away, she pulled him out through the inn's back door into the cool night air, beneath a sky bright with stars and the last dying glow of the torches that had ringed the dueling ground hours before. I am free, she said, turning her face up to the night sky, wonder plain in her voice. Truly free, Charles, for the first time in my whole life. My own price paid by my own hand, my own choice made before witnesses who cannot unmake it. Do you understand what that means, to a woman raised believing her worth was never hers to set? I think I'm beginning to, Charles said, watching her with a heart so full he could hardly speak around it. I've spent my whole life feeling like the sort of man nobody looks at twice. Overlooked. Ordinary. And then you came crashing through my window with a spear through your side and a knife at my throat, and somehow, out of every man on every road in this whole wide world, you chose me. I don't think I'll ever stop marveling at that, Snaga. Not if we've got 50 years together. 50 years, Snaga repeated, turning to face him fully, the starlight catching in her dark eyes. I intend to hold you to that, apothecary. I did not fight a champion twice my size and empty 10 years of hard-earned coin into my father's hands to settle for anything less than the whole of your life beside mine. Then you've got it, Charles said, and pulled her close, and kissed her there beneath the stars with none of the desperate fear that had colored their last stolen moments before the trial, only certainty now, only the deep, settled warmth of two people who had fought in their own different ways for exactly this. Every year of it, however many were given. She laughed against his mouth, warm and unguarded, and drew him closer still, her hands fisting in the front of his shirt just as they had that very first night she stopped being careful with him. And Charles Lockhart understood, standing there in the torchlight with the whole trade road quiet around them, and the woman he loved solid and real and finally, fully free in his arms, that he had found something far rarer than he had ever dared hope for in his solitary years at the crossing. Not just a patient healed, not just a fugitive sheltered, but a partner, an equal, a fierce and magnificent woman who had looked at every choice available to her and chosen him, again and again with her whole unguarded heart. They were married the following spring, in a ceremony that blended both their traditions in ways that made old Hesper Vane laugh until she cried vows spoken in the old orc way. Over crossed blades and a shared cup of blood-red wine, followed by a human blessing read by the traveling priest who happened to be passing through the crossing that very week, as if fate itself had arranged the timing. Snaga Steeljaw attended, gruff and awkward in his finest furs, and even Drask came, bearing a wedding gift of forged iron that Charles suspected was as close to an apology as the enforcer knew how to offer. Snaga wore her battle leather still, refitted and polished for the occasion, because she declared she saw no reason to dress as anything other than exactly what she was, a warrior who had won her own freedom and meant to keep it. The Wayfarers' Crossing remained their home. The surgery wing expanded now to include a second table and a wall of shelves that Snaga herself had built, strong enough to hold jars and tools that would outlast them both. Word of the healer's orc wife spread down every branch of the trade road in the seasons that followed, and travelers came sometimes just to see them, the border town apothecary and the chief's daughter who had fought for her own bride price and won, and found in each other exactly the kind of love that no chief's decree or clan tradition could ever have arranged. And every evening, when the last patient had been tended and the common room's noise had settled into its familiar late-night hum, Charles Lockhart and Snaga Steeljaw retreated to their rooms above the surgery and held each other beneath the same lantern light that had first illuminated her wounds and his steady, unafraid hands, and neither one of them, not once in all the years that followed, ever again had to wonder whether they were wanted or chosen, or loved with a fierceness that asked for nothing but exactly what the other had to give.